So the first thing I'm going to do is start building the armature. And as you see, I've got a board of wood and a stick that I'm gluing together. After that's glued together, I'm going to screw the two pieces together through the bottom of the board. If you notice, I've drawn diagonal lines from corner to corner on the board, and I've lined the corners of the stick piece up with those lines, and that's a really quick and easy way to find the center of your board so that just aesthetically the piece that the sculpture is actually going to be sitting on is exactly in the center. It's not necessary, but it does help the presentation a little bit. After I've drilled my initial hole to guide the screw through, I'm just widening the very opening of that hole so that when I drill the screw through it, the head will sit into that plank of wood so that it won't scrape up the surface of any table or whatever that it might end up sitting on. The next step is to drill a hole for the armature wire. I use aluminum armature wire, which you can find from any good art store should have this. But if you can't find any locally, it would pay to look it up on the internet. Any good sculpting supply company will have aluminum armature wire. And what I'm doing here is off screen I have that drawing that we looked at earlier. And I'm trying to match the angles of that wire with the drawing. I'm only going to be sculpting the head, neck, and shoulders of the creature. What I'm doing here is just trying to get those angles more or less right. I will be adjusting it throughout the whole process, even when I get the clay on, and even in the later stages of the sculpture, you'll see me continue adjusting everything to get the maximum effect in the pose. And as you can see, I put a little loop at the end of that wire so that when the clay starts getting put on there, the weight of the clay won't make the sculpture impale itself on the wire. And what I'm doing here is I've taken a piece of insulation foam from a hardware store. I've just scored it and cut it into little square cubes, which I'm now laying on with super glue to bulk out the areas of the sculpture that have more mass to them. This is to save on clay and also to cut down the weight. And the object of this, of course, is to keep those styrene pieces well within the circumference of the final sculpture, which at this point I can only guess at. But I will be going through with a razor later on and just carving off all the edges, which I believe will get in the way when I start sculpting. You want to leave a good bit of thickness between. You want to leave a good thickness of clay all around the sculpture because you never know when you're going to want to hollow an area out more or less. those hand gestures I'm doing is just to I'm trying to get into my head like how the clay sculpture will sit on it. I've known a few people who do a more elaborate variation of this where they'll take a block of styrene, very fine-grained styrene, and essentially carve their final sculpture in that and only do a layer of clay on the outside for the purpose of skin texturing. First of all, they get really great results that way, but for me, I just think that takes all the fun out of sculpting. It doesn't allow you to do much exploration once the clay is on. So this process is, for me, really just to save money on clay and cut down the weight. It also gives the clay something more to grab onto than just a wire by itself, and that's a good thing. All the while, I'm still referencing that drawing. Even though that's not necessarily a final design, it's a good indication of where I need to bulk out mass and where I should probably leave the armature alone. Now comes the time to put the plastiline onto the armature and start the actual sculpture. I'm packing it on as tightly as I can and just trying not to leave any air pockets between the clay and the armature. That's really important because you can run into problems later on if you don't do that. Notice I'm really smearing the clay onto the styrofoam bits. Clay doesn't necessarily stick to that styrofoam very well, so I really try to just rub it in and get it to stay. I suppose ideally what I could have done was melt the clay in a slow cooker to the point where it's very liquid, and then use a chip brush to brush that onto the styrofoam, and that would actually help it to bite into it a little bit. At this stage, it's only really important to make sure that clay is where the mass needs to be. I'm not letting myself get too hung up about how it looks at this stage because that would just be a little too depressing. I'm just looking at my design and thinking of the overall form, and right now it's just where do I need mass? And in roughly what general shape is that mass? I try my best to take a holistic approach to sculpting where I just look at it from the biggest, roughest forms first and then move my way down into details. One of the first things I've done is to try to get the jaw in there because I feel that's such an important part of this character to have that aggressive looking underslung jaw with the slight underbite. I think along with the shape of the backward sloping cranium and that crooked neck that hangs below the shoulders, that basically forms the essence of this character. It gives it an aggressive, avaricious, scavenger-like feel right from the start. I mean, I think whatever your character is, it's important to establish that in the overall major forms so that within just a second of looking at it, people can get what this character is supposed to be. From across a room and within the first second of looking at it, they should be able to get what your creature's personality is. And the details are really just incidental. Or they're not incidental, but it's important to get the main thrust of the character first and roughly in the overall larger forms. Smaller details and features sort of correspond to that overriding feeling, as if they were smaller echoes of it. A lot of sculpting just comes down to being patient because, well, it looks like I'm going pretty fast here, but this is, of course, sped up film. Most of your sculpture doesn't start looking like anything until about maybe 40 to 50% of the way through. So for a long time, it's just going to look it's going to look kind of stupid and be sort of disheartening. If I hadn't done as many sculptures as I've done already, I'd probably be about a little bit discouraged at this point. But it's important to just soldier on and know that it's going to look cool. Hopefully. If you remember what I said before about keeping that styrofoam well within the surface of the clay, that's really hard to gauge. So what I'm doing now is some of that clay just was too thin at the top of the head, so I've gone in and cut that styrofoam out so I can have more clay on top of the head to play with later. And this is a good stage to do that kind of intrusive surgery on because it's not too far along where it's traumatic to have to change it. But by the way, a sculptor I would recommend anybody to look at, uh, who I found extremely helpful, is a guy named Rembrandt Bugatti, who was an Italian sculptor who sculpted animals, who lived during the early part of the 1900s. He had this style where he sculpted animals in an almost impressionistic way that borderlined on abstract, but not quite. It was still very representational. His method was to break animals down into their basic rhythms and geometries. He would break things down into their most basic forms, and it was more about just the gesture of the movement, the lines that run through a particular animal's body, like a cat, with like an S curved back. And that was just a really an eye opener when I first saw his work. It really, because even though I work for the most part, I work in the movies, and that sort of work is extremely detail oriented. I try to approach everything in a way that's similar to Rembrandt Bugatti, at least in the beginning stages. I try to think of it as if though I were doing that type of gestural impressionistic sculpture. Because even though there wasn't a whole lot of detail in his work, in the finished work, it had all the life and energy and attitude that it needed to have, and was just incredibly striking and effective for that reason. I would recommend anyone to look at him because simply looking at his work almost teaches you how to sculpt. It's almost as though everything's spelled out right in front of you. If you get a chance, try to do an online search for him, for his work. His last name is spelled Bugatti.